Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming to this very interesting event about the substantial equivalent issue. My name is Michael Cohane. I'm a member of the Civil Rights Committee at the City Bar Association. And for me, this issue is really a civil rights. I, as a kid, attended one of these schools. And so I've seen it firsthand what this does for kids not to get an education. I think for many people, not getting an education those formal years leaves them with a real deficit. Many people, grow into adulthood, they're unable to do the basic, like they can't fill out forms in the banks or, when they go to the doctor. They can't find jobs. It leaves them totally reliant on other people, and in many cases to get social programs. So this is a real issue that affects many children. But at the same time, there's this issue of parental rights. Parents have a right to raise their kids as they choose. So this is what this discussion is going to be about. We're going to discuss the tension between these two, the children's right to get like a basic education with the parents' right to raise their children as they see fit, and everything in between. And we're also going to touch about the states, what the state can do and how the state can regulate and ensure that these children get the education they deserve. We have a very interesting panel, people who have been very deeply involved in this issue. Beatrice Weber, Professor Burt Neuborne, who's a constitutional expert, Michael Rebell, who's been very involved in educational issues, and Sarah Richmond, who's worked with different private schools. Just a technical point before we get started, the Q&A is going to be open. If anyone has a question, just feel free to ask the question. We'll get to it during the discussion, or at the end, we'll leave some time for question if anyone has a question or a comment. And that way, please do that. Please ask questions, engage the speakers. And we'll try to get to it. So let's jump right in. Our first guest tonight is going to be Beatrice Weber. And Beatrice has like an incredible story. I personally have been very inspired by the things she has done and the journey she has gone through for herself and as the director of YAFFED. And YAFFED has been at the forefront of this issue. I'm sure we'll hear more about what YAFFED has done. And Beatrice has worked with politicians, she has worked with legislators, been involved in some of the cases, and she's even taken on some schools for her own child. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Beatrice to this event. Beatrice, tell us a little about yourself.
Yeah, good evening. I will try to share a little PowerPoint that has the information that I'd like to share with you, and we'll go from there.
Sure.
Okay. Okay, one second. Let's see. Okay. This is okay. So I'm gonna give you a little bit of an overview of my personal experience dealing with the fact that my children did not get a substantial equivalent education here in New York State, and my role at YAFFED, and then what YAFFED continues to do to fight for an education for all children in New York State. So I grew up in the Hasidic community. As you can see, this is me with 9 of my 10 children. You can see I have 5 boys here, but there's a 6th boy. He's 12 now, which I'll talk a little bit more about. So all of my children went to schools in New York State and did not receive a substantial equivalent education. I'll talk a little bit about what a substantial equivalent education is, what do the yeshivas look like today, and what is the work that YAFFED's trying to do to rectify that. Here I am up in Albany, trying to work with legislators. It's quite an interesting conversation that I had during this time, which I'll mention a little later on. Okay, so first of all, YAFFED's mission. YAFFED is an organization that advocates that all Haredi and Hasidic yeshivas in New York State deliver a sound basic education to their children. I want to be clear that this is an issue that does not only exist in New York State, but is in fact an international issue. And I believe you, Michael, did not go to school in New York State, but yet this is a systemic issue. Wherever there is a large Hasidic population, you're going to have this issue. So we have this issue largely in New York. There are pockets of it in New Jersey. There are pockets, in Europe, in Canada, in Israel. So this is a systemic issue that crosses borders. And it's helpful sometimes to look at what's going on in other places, and that informs and might inform us of possible progress or issues here. There are over 200 yeshivas in New York State serving both boys and girls, and they serve them separately. And we're in the middle of conducting a study, so we should have more clear information shortly. But we know that at least 65,000 of those students are not receiving a basic education as required by the education law. And there's more recently, there was an administrative mechanism set up to enforce this law, which I will talk about soon as a result of YAFFED's advocacy. So this is a huge number of individuals and students across this state that are not receiving an education. Here's what it looks like for children. So first of all, just to understand the landscape, children in the Hasidic community are going to separate schools from the time they're 3 years old. There's schools for boys and schools for girls. Generally, the girls' schools are on a little bit higher of a standard. Some of them often take Regents exam. But for the boys in Hasidic schools, when we're talking about kind of those 65,000 students, they really lack basic English, math, and science. They for the most that they have in general, again, there are some exceptions, but the vast majority of them, we're talking about school between 60 to 90 minutes a day, 4 days a week for 5 years. So from the time they turn 8 till the time they turn 13, they're being taught somewhat, but oftentimes the teachers are themselves, they're definitely not trained as teachers, but oftentimes they themselves can't speak English well. They have not gone to high school and they have not gone to elementary school. As I mentioned to you, this education ends by the time they're 13. So you have now, 2-3 generations of young men who have not received a high school education. In terms of number, in terms of percentages, the latest estimate we've heard is that by 2030, 30% of students, not Jewish students overall in Brooklyn will be Hasidic. Okay, so this is an issue that affects all of us in New York. It doesn't only affect these children who are not receiving an education. Now, if you look here at this little chart, I hope you can see it, but it looks here at the different denominations, at the different Jewish denominations, and this looks specifically closer to New York City. This is old data. And again, as I mentioned, this organization that used to collect this data no longer exists. YAFFED is conducting a study, so we'll know a lot more soon. But we're looking at a total in 2018. By now, its estimates are it's grown at least 25%. We're looking at close to 170,000 children in Jewish schools. Okay, the ones that we're concerned about are the ones in the Hasidic schools, some of the Chabad students, and in the yeshiva students. We have about half and half of them are not receiving an education. So you can see from these numbers, a substantial percentage of children in Jewish schools have this issue. Again, in many Jewish schools and some yeshivas, the education is top-notch. For instance, in the modern Orthodox communities, the education in those schools are top-notch. But the Hasidic yeshivas where my children attended and where so many other parents send their children, there is a lack of a basic education. By the time my son, my 12-year-old, was 7 years old, he read more fluently than his teachers. Okay, and he would correct his teachers. The level of how they learn is so low. You may have seen some of the reports that came out of these schools where they took the standardized testing and every single child in the school failed, and they did not have the basics of what they're supposed to have. I'm going to give you now a rundown of the history, the challenges, and successes of YAFFED. So first of all, YAFFED was founded in 2012 by students of these Hasidic yeshivas. The founder's name is Naftali Moster. Some of you who are involved with this probably heard of his name. He was a kid that went to a Hasidic yeshiva, was determined to go to college at the age of 20, and was horrified to realize what he had been missing all those years. He also discovered at that point that there's actually a law that you need to teach in non-public schools. Me as a parent within the Hasidic community, we did not know that. We thought that we were doing the right thing and we were sending our children to the school. If you belong to the Hasidic community, you need to send your children to Hasidic schools. And we didn't know that the schools were actually doing something wrong, that they were not teaching as per the requirement of the law. And to be honest, many politicians and lawmakers also did not have clarity on this. He first began conversations with politicians, with Hasidic and Orthodox leaders, but that yielded no results, and he was basically laughed out of every single place. In 2014, they did their first huge public information campaign, purchased a billboard in the Hasidic neighborhoods, because at that point, none of the Hasidic advertising media would take any advertisements from YAFFED. They were afraid of what this was going to mean for them. So, large billboards that made quite a bit of noise. And the first legal action was taken in 2015 when YAFFED filed a complaint against 39 different yeshivas in New York City, and it included about 50 students and parents of these schools. Now, to be clear, upstate, this problem is the same. This happened to be New York City schools because that's where the students were from. This exact same problem exists up in Rockland County, up in Orange County, and even beginning in Sullivan County as well. So it's not unique to New York City. In 2019, there was a preliminary report released, doesn't name any yeshivas, and no further action is taken. There's also the Department of Investigations of New York City gets involved and finds out that there has been some horse trading where the report was being delayed in order to guarantee mayoral control. There were some emails leaked. So it was clear that this was very political and everybody's trying to suppress it and delay it as much as possible. In 2019, I filed...
Sorry, Beatrice, if I can just jump in here for a second, because you're touching on many different things, which I kind of want to get to. So you mentioned that in 2015, YAFFED filed a complaint against some of the schools. Did this complaint include parents? Because I was wondering, why don't parents get involved with this? Why don't parents try to change it? What's with the parents?
So yes, so there were several parents included in this, but most of the parents who complained were people who had left the Hasidic community and for whatever reason still had children in the community. So it's when you're in the Hasidic community, you're very reliant on the community it's like a kind of a total institution where you're relying on the community for your income, for your housing, and the risk of speaking up means you stand to lose all of that. When I filed my complaint in 2019, I experienced those negative effects. I was being stalked. I ended up needing to move. I was, I had a job in the community. I was let go from that job. So there's very serious consequences to speaking up, and people are very afraid. I often speak to people from the community. They'll reach out and they'll be very, very upset about what's going on, but will be absolutely terrified to file a legal complaint. And they're even terrified that anybody should know they're even speaking with us. So there's a lot of fear, and the fear is legitimate. There are serious consequences for people speaking up. So one of the legal actions that YAFFED is involved with currently, and in December, we're going to have oral arguments, is about our standing, that YAFFED should be able to have standing and be able to, bring more cases in front of the court. By the time I filed my complaint, I already had a college degree, even though I hadn't graduated high school. By then, I had gotten my college degree. I had a job. I was kind of in and out of the community already, so I did take that step. But for many parents, filing a complaint would be literal risk, huge risk for themselves and their family.
The other thing I wanted to get to very briefly, though, you had mentioned that de Blasio, there was some games being played with de Blasio. Can you just go into that a little?
So what happened was in 2015, this complaint was filed, and it sat for 4 years till 2019, and no serious action was taken. Part of the process was this had never happened before. Nobody ever complained about these yeshivas. This was kind of an ongoing kind of unspoken secret between politicians, school, the administration and the schools, where it's kind of known that these schools weren't teaching much, but everybody turned a blind eye and nobody complained about it. And then it was clear that there were efforts to block this from actually being investigated. And a lot of this issue, the political power that the community holds, is around the voting. Now, I think Michael Rebell is going to talk more about this, but just as they're not being taught about the history, science, social studies, none of that. They're not really taught about what it means to vote for anybody, what it looks like, and instead they're instructed. The community is instructed who to vote for, and you see that if you look at the voting trends, that the Hasidic community in their neighborhoods will really vote as a single block. So politicians, and it will depend on that, and will try to do whatever they can to do what the leadership wants them to do, not necessarily what is best for the children. So there's a lot of tension. When you talk about tension, there's a lot of tension there in terms of how the leadership wants to portray the community, what the leadership wants from the community versus what many of the families want and what the children deserve as their right in New York State.
Yeah, the other thing, you had mentioned that you filed a complaint. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so in 2019, I filed that complaint. As a result of a family court ruling, I had to keep my son in a Hasidic yeshiva. By that point, he was my youngest. My older sons were already adults, and I saw the struggles they had with employment. I had already gone to college, as an adult, had a college degree, benefited from the result of having an education, being able to support my family on my own, and I was not permitted to remove him from that school because of a family court order. So I said, okay, you know what? He needs to stay there. Let's see what we can do to improve what's going on in the school. Now, similarly, that was also went back and forth between the city and the state for over 2 years. And only at the end, in October 2022, 3 years later, was the ruling actually handed down, whereby the state agreed that the school was not substantially equivalent and instructed them to improve their curriculum. Importantly, the Department of Education of New York City tried to pass off the school as being substantially equivalent, and I'm happy to share that ruling, with anybody. But it was like, oh, we heard this kids speak English. That means, they really brought very lame proof of how the school is substantially equivalent, but the state agreed that it was not, and that was the first school ever in New York State to be found non-compliant. And that set off that in 2003, if you can see here, finally those 39 schools, were at least 27 of them were finally investigated, and also 18 of them were found to be non-compliant as well. And 2022 was really a watershed year for this issue. So in addition to YMH being found non-compliant, also the NYSED finally, after great pressure from YAFFED, they finally passed regulations to enforce substantial equivalency. Now, substantial equivalency, which means that you can have a non-public school, but it needs to teach a similar curriculum to what's in a public school, has been a law for over 100 years. But There was never an actual mechanism and regulations of how to enforce it. So finally, in September 2022, those regulations were passed, and the local school authorities were given very, very clear directions on how to make sure that schools are teaching in a manner that complies with the regulations. Those regulations are due to be implemented by the end of the school year. So this conversation is very timely. And in addition, in 2022, there was also extensive reporting by the New York Times, which made this issue really in the forefront of people's mind. People for many years looked away, kind of didn't know what was really gone in this community, but having that really extensive research and reporting done by the New York Times really brought it to the public's attention. And in fact, as a result of that, there was a corporal punishment bill passed for non-public schools that forbid corporal punishment to happen, which was a great result. And the reporting also noted that over $250 million of tax dollars go annually to support these schools as non-public schools. So that was very important, and important to us as taxpayers to understand that.
So I just want to go back for a second. You had mentioned, what happened with the government. And, one of the things you hear from people, and I think like even Eric Adams said it, this is an insular community. This is a group that kind of like, does its own thing, and they have their own life. Like, and I guess you answered it, but like, why should like the state get involved in this, what seems to be the perfect ideal life that they have? Things seem good. It's a nonviolent community. But what would you say to Eric Adams? How do you respond to that? I mean, I guess you've responded to it, but
yeah, I mean, first of all, it's the law, so that's number one, right? It's very clear that there are laws around education for children in the state, so it's not really much of a conversation around that. And in addition, when you're raising children in a country, to raise them and that they don't know the language of their country, they can't speak, that is at high risk. And I think it's dangerous to say that this is a community without any crime, because there is crime. And oftentimes people don't have the language or don't know of the resources available because of the lack of education. So again, I mentioned the corporal punishment bill. The reason that bill came into being was when the New York Times was doing their reporting, it was mostly focused on education, but they kept on hearing about the corporal punishment. That still goes on in these schools, so there was a law passed against that. There's definitely crime happening. It may look different than in other communities, but I think it's really unsafe and not really goes against every right of a human being to be raised in a city and in a country and not being given the access to study the language and the basics. To be clear, a substantial equivalent education is very basic. It's like your minimum, of what needs to be done. We're not talking about anything sophisticated. I know there are many who like to paint this as being a woke agenda. Absolutely not. Like and to be clear, there are many Haredi schools and girls' schools in the Hasidic community that are teaching a substantially equivalent education. It is possible to be done within the culture and in an appropriate way. And yes, you can skip out evolution. That's fine. You may not be able to pass that question on your Regents exam, but you can skip out that chapter. And there is absolutely no requirement for sex education at all. So I just want to be really clear that this is just about giving children a basic education in the very basic subjects. Just to catch us up to where we are today, there's currently legal action being taken by Pearls, which is an organization that represents yeshivas and represents, to be clear, the business interests of yeshivas. And they are now at the Court of Appeals. So that's going to happen probably at the beginning of next year. We'll see what happens with that. We are also at a point that some of the 18 schools that were found non-compliant in 2023 have refused to cooperate with NYSED and are not working with them at all, which is, so NYSED is at a point of needing to make decisions what to do with those schools. according to the latest court ruling, they're not allowed to shut down those schools, but they're allowed to declare them non-compliant and remove their funding. The latest I hear from YMAH is they are kind of cooperating, but so far they're not substantially equivalent, which is upsetting. My son was not allowed back into the school. So that was another reason why people don't complain about the schools, because they kicked my son out and he wasn't allowed back. Now I'm grateful because he's in a fabulous school now, getting a fabulous, Jewish and secular education. It's amazing. But all those children who are still in the school are there hasn't been much visible improvement at all.
I guess I have a question on that. Based on what you've been saying, like, why do these schools not want to cooperate? Like, what is the community's interest in keeping these children in ignorance? Maybe that's a harsh word, but uneducated.
Yeah. So first of all, I believe, but again, this is a hypothesis, that if in the 50s and the 60s, when these Hasidic schools started, they would have had the oversight, I think it might have looked very different, but there wasn't the oversight. Those schools were small, people looked away. And then right now, they're huge institutions, as I mentioned before, getting $250 million. When you have that kind of money and that kind of power, like, why would you want to give it up at all? And then the community has gotten used to this. And right now, I think there's a lot of fear that bringing in an additional education might rock the boat a little bit, and people might, yes, go for that education and might, choose something a little bit different. Though I want to be clear that in the parts of the Haredi community that they do get an education, there isn't a higher a percentage of people leaving the community. So I think it's more fair than anything else. But I would say leadership has just gotten comfortable with being able to take in all that money, very little oversight, and it's just what they're used to.
Okay.
I mean, I think we spoke about, like, those are the challenges, really. I think we mostly spoke about the challenges, the fear people have of speaking up, the retribution, and again, something that's really, I think, important to understand, that people in the community don't have access to mainstream media. The internet is forbidden. So people might have a secret phone that they use, but there isn't widespread access to the media. The entire media that they consume is really very slanted and in terms of the information that they're given. So they'll, talk about how, YAFFED's trying to destroy our education, and they'll have propaganda videos with, like, people coming into their schools and taking away all their Hebrew books and things like that, which is absolutely propaganda. So it really makes it very hard for people in the community to know what is actually going on. What is the law? How will this impact them? What are their rights when you only have access to media that's controlled by leadership in the community? So I think that's important to note as well, your whole perspective and understanding of how things are.
Let me ask you another question. Given where we are, like, there's been a rise in anti-Semitism, and this community is a community that's very visibly Jewish. And, I think, like, there's a balance. You don't want to be dismissive of their fears and the issues they face looking the way they look. But at the same time, like, you're dealing with all these kids and everything you've described, like, feels like a travesty. So how in your mind, how can you, be constructive in your criticism and try to deal with this issue while being sensitive to what they face, the community faces?
Yeah, and I just want to be clear, my children are Hasidic, and my youngest son, though he goes to a progressive Jewish school, dresses like a Hasidic child. So I totally relate to those fears, and especially, again, as a grandchild of Holocaust survivors. But I will say one thing that I learned as a child growing up in the community, the first thing we learned was not to make a Chilul Hashem, a desecration of God's name. And that would include not obeying the law, right? We were taught as young children, like, obey the law. If you go to the park, make sure to pick up your garbage, so nobody should be able to look at you and say, look what you're doing. So I think, number one, I think the community should look themselves and be, are we doing the right thing? Are we doing the ethical steps? And one of the challenges, and I just want to say that YAFFED being accused of, has happened as long as YAFFED has been around. And unfortunately, it's an easy way to deflect from a real issue. I think we're very sensitive to talk about, there are some sectors of the community that do it this way. There are some sectors, again, emphasize how it's proper to be culturally aware. But the fact that these schools take in it was, I think, $1 billion over 4 years. And you have, thousands of students who none of them could pass a state level test. It's really hard to say, that has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. In fact, I will say that what happens in these situations is it's the children that lose out. When you start saying, oh, bringing up this issue, causes anti-Semitism, what ends up happening is that these children lose out and don't get the rights that they deserve. So I think, yes, being mindful, never making, broad statements and all of that, but at the same time, keeping in mind that these are children, just like any other children who deserve an education.
Okay, so we have to move along. I just wanted to give you a chance, first of all, if people want to get involved with YAFFED, what can they do? And then what's on the horizon with YAFFED? What is its future goals?
So since I'm sitting in a room here with attorneys, I will say that come June 2025, based on what we're hearing, we don't see that the schools are taking the steps. So we assume a lot of the schools will not be compliant. And YAFFED has already gotten together a number of law firms to be able to start filing the legal actions that will be required to ensure that these schools do come up to par. So definitely, please get in touch with us. And I have the information on the last page. Please get in touch with this email address, or you can get in touch with the organizers of this event. We are looking to put together a group of attorneys who will be able to kind of tackle this, because the work is going to be absolutely monumental. YAFFED does have a lawyer on staff, but we are going to need more. And please sign up at yaffed.org. Okay, you can go there. We regularly send out emails. If you read our emails, you'll be up to date on what is happening from the legal, from the political, and all of that. And yeah, so those are the two ways best ways that you can actually be involved and understand, what is going on.
Okay, well, thank you so much for coming here. I really appreciate your time, and this has been very illuminating. Oh, I see we have a question here. Is this data for general ed students only, or does it include students? I think you're talking about all students, right? Not only IEP students. I mean, I'm not sure I understand the question, but I think all students don't get the education they need to.
Correct. Yes.
Okay. Well, our next guest is Michael Rebell. He's a well-known professor in the education law. He's a professor at Columbia University Law and Educational, and a visiting professor at Harvard Law School, the executive director of the Center of Educational Equity, and he's written numerous articles and books on equity in education. Professor Rebell, it's really a pleasure having you here.
Okay, well, thank you, Michael. I'm going to begin by picking up on a question you asked, Beatrice, that I really want to emphasize the importance of the answer to. Beatrice and you were describing in great detail the impact, the harm that's being done to these children who go through school without learning basic English language skills, math, science, etc., which is the primary concern. But I think you asked, what business is it of the state? This is a self-contained community. They want to stay distant from the state. They say, leave us alone. This is our culture. This is our religion. Let us do it our way. Well, I think Professor Neuborne later on will go into the background of the constitutional law. But this does go back over 100 years, as Beatrice said. And we're talking about compulsory education in New York. So over 100 years ago, New York and many other states passed these compulsory education laws requiring all children to go to school for a certain number of years. That was in the state's interest. They wanted educated kids. We have a democracy. They wanted kids who would have enough background in American history, in what's going on in their country and how the government works, to be able to vote intelligently, to participate in civic activities. So they required compulsory education. Now, those laws were challenged, and some people said this is inconsistent with religion. It's inconsistent with parents' rights to bring up their kids the way they want to bring them up. These are the arguments that many of the Hasidic lawyers are making in court these days. But that was resolved over 100 years ago, and I guess Professor Neuborne is going to go into detail about the Pierce case. But suffice it to say, the U.S. Supreme Court, back in 1924, I think it was, 25, said the way we're going to balance these rights here is to say, yes, parents have a right to send their kids to a religious school, to a private school, so long as the education in those schools prepares kids properly to be civic members of our society. That was the Supreme Court law years ago, 100 years ago. New York State picked that up and said, okay, kids can go to private school, whatever private school, they can even do homeschooling, so long as they're properly preparing their children to enter our society. That's where substantial equivalence came from. And in New York, they spelled out what is preparation for being in the civic society. And they said it's basic math, reading, science, and civics, by the way. Okay, so what is the state's interest? The state's interest is that people living in this country can be good citizens on some kind of minimal basic level. Now, Beatrice brought up the important point that members of these community do take part in our civic society in many ways, but one of the most important is they vote, and they vote more than most other citizens. They vote in a block, and I am sure their percentage of voters in the last election and all recent elections is much higher than the national average. Okay, that's great that they're voting. But as Beatrice also pointed out, they don't know what they're voting for. None of these kids we're talking about have had basic American history. How do you vote on who should be president? Or if you're in New York City, about whether we should pass this new constitutional amendment about equal rights for various categories of people, important issues. How do you vote on that? First of all, you can hardly read English and see what it's saying. But secondly, you have no context. You have no background. So this is very much in the state's interest. And one other legal point I want to emphasize is that whatever the state legislature wants to do or not do, and they've done a lot in New York, but the state constitution, as interpreted by our Court of Appeals, the highest court, has said every child in this state has a constitutional right under the New York State Constitution to the opportunity for sound basic education. Now, the state education departments, their job, they've defined the sound basic education in essence, and it's in that compulsory education law. It's got to be basic math, reading, science, civics, American history, a number of other things. That's a kid's right. They're being denied this right. They're not old enough to go to court and exercise their rights. Their parents could, Beatrice did, but none of the other parents are doing this. So that's why it is important for the legislature and for the Commissioner of Education, who's been the one who's been active in this area, to take a stand in enforcing the state law, in enforcing the students' rights, and say these schools are not complying with what our state constitution requires, with what our state laws require. And as Beatrice pointed out, it took the state ed department about 100 years to put together a set of regulations that would allow for real enforcement of this law. Before 2022, basically the law said that it's up to the superintendent in every school district to make sure that all the schools under their jurisdiction are complying with substantial compliance. And of course, that means the elite private schools, any private school, but it also means all religious schools. Yeah, they can teach Jewish history, they can teach the Talmud, they can teach whatever they want in the area of religion, but they also have to teach basic English, math, science, social studies. So we now have regulations that spell out what the procedure should be if the state believes that there's a question about whether a school is being substantially compliant. And I won't go into the details of all the regulations that the state has issued. Suffice it to say that because they've started enforcing this, and Beatrice's case is the first one that did seriously look at the curriculum and what was going on in a particular yeshiva and said it's not up to the standards that are in our state law and our state regulations. The Commissioner of Education issued the ruling in her case. The Pearls case that Beatrice mentioned, which is now pending for decision before the Court of Appeals, our highest court in the state, is a case that was brought by this coalition of groups that are supporting the yeshivas, which is challenging the state's right to issue these regulations. I don't want to, well, I guess this is being sponsored by the Bar Association. Maybe I should go into the law in a little bit of detail, but basically the argument that was made in the lower court was that the state doesn't have the authority to issue these regulations at all. And the lower court rejected that. The lower court did say that there were proper procedures. There had been an earlier case that an earlier version of guidelines that the state ed department put out did not fully comply with the administrative law requirements. But this time, the same judge who had ruled against the state in that case said, yes, this time they did it right. They did the proper procedures. These regulations, by and large, are valid, except two specific provisions of the regulations the lower court held to be in violation of the statutory law. Those provisions basically had to do with what the penalty is for a school that's non-compliant. And essentially, under the regulations, the commissioner who finds, if the commissioner finds that a school is non-compliant and declares that the school is in violation of substantial compliance, basically, she's saying that kids can't go there anymore, that the school is not providing the proper education under substantial equivalence, and parents are on notice that they should pull their kids out and send them elsewhere. The schools, of course, are not happy with that result, because in reality, it means if no parents can enroll their kids in these schools, the schools are not going to be in business for long. I mean, some have said they can hold themselves out as providing after-school programs, and well, actually, there are a lot of after-school Hebrew schools and all that do pretty well. But these schools don't want to be a few hours a day after public school or whatever. They want to be not only open the number of hours that regular public schools are, but many more hours. As we know, these schools are normally open 9 to 4, 9 to 6, depending on the age. So if the commissioner declares that the school doesn't satisfy compulsory education, that can be devastating for the schools. And that's true, and that's a penalty. That's why they ought to comply. And by the way, these regulations have extensive procedures that give the schools all kinds of opportunity to present their case, to show why they're in compliance. And if they're found not in compliance initially, there are all kinds of procedures. The New York City Department of Ed, or whatever the local school district is, has to work with them, has to go through negotiation processes to try to help them comply. So after all of that, if they're still out of compliance, like the school where Beatrice's son had gone, the commissioner can declare that they're out of compliance, and the implication is the parents can't send their kids there anymore. The lower court held that that specific penalty provision is not in compliance with the authority of the commissioner, because elsewhere in the state law, there are penalties that are spelled out for parents, and the burden is on the parents to comply with the compulsory education law. So the state, the school district, the family court can penalize a parent who is sending a child to a non-compliant school, but there are no explicit words that say the school itself has to close. So that's why the lower court said all of the regulations are valid, except if a school's declared non-compliant, it's up to the parents to do something to come into compliance. And, theoretically, if their kid gets out of school at 6 o'clock, they could send them to an after school, not a Hebrew school program, I guess, an English school program or something, to get 3 hours of cramming on English language and American history and everything else. Not likely to happen, as we all know. Anyhow, make a long story short, that decision of the lower court in Albany County went up on appeal to the Appellate Division, 3rd Department, and by I think it was a 3-to-1 majority, that court overruled that decision and said the commissioner has inherent authority to enforce the law. The way she's enforcing it is reasonable, and therefore all provisions of the regulations are upheld. So that decision of the Appellate Division is what Pearls is now going to be appealing to the Court of Appeals, and that probably will be argued this spring, as far as I know.
So essentially, and I want to get, I see we have some questions and I want to get to that, but essentially, once, and say that the Court of Appeal upholds the 3rd Department's ruling, that means that these LSAs can now like label these schools as non-compliant. What's going to happen after that? Like, say that a school is considered it's not substantially equivalent. What's next?
That's a good question. I mean, it's illegal for that school if the ruling is upheld, I believe it would be illegal for that school to hold itself out as a school that parents can send their children to be compliant with the education law. And if they continue to run illegal programs, I suppose they can be shut down, or at least they can be barred from enrolling students for full-day programs.
Okay, let's just get to some of the questions. Gavin, I think I'm going to leave your question to Professor Neuborne because it pertains to the constitutional issues. So let's just, there's another question here. How was the Felder Amendment, how has it changed the definition of substantial equivalency?
Okay, very good question. This Felder Amendment was passed a couple of years ago. Felder was a member of the community in Brooklyn, the Hasidic community, and they thought that they had really undermined the power of the substantial equivalence law as it applied to Hasidic schools, because that amendment said for certain schools that are open from 9 to 4 or 9 to 6, and they have other criteria that basically are saying only for Hasidic schools, independent schools, if you're talking about Dalton or Horace Mann or something, they're not covered by the Felder Amendment. It's only the Hasidic schools, which in and of itself raises an interesting legal question that I won't go into. But what they did is try to redefine what substantial equivalence means. And let's say in the case of the high schools, because they broke it out and different criteria for the elementary and the high schools, but I find the high school one especially interesting. They say a high school is in compliance with this law as long as it teaches students critical thinking. And if they have a curriculum that makes them critical thinkers, that would comply with the requirement to provide a sound basic education, and therefore with the substantial compliance law. So really what they're getting at is, if you're studying Talmud, if you're really into understanding intricacies of Jewish law, there's a lot of critical thinking there, that's for sure. And a child who's getting a good, solid Talmudic education probably is developing good critical thinking. But when drafting that, and this hasn't come to the courts yet, but I'm going to speak to this as the lawyer who brought the CFE case, which was where the Court of Appeals defined what a sound basic education is. They use that term, sound basic education, and I don't think they understood what it meant. And it hasn't been tested. But basically, sound basic education is more than critical thinking. For one thing, it's the skills and knowledge you need to be a civic participant capable of voting and serving on a jury. That was part of the specific definition the Court of Appeals gave for sound basic education. So again, emphasizing the civic education aspects of this, a kid who may have great critical thinking from all his Jewish studies, if he is not able to capably vote and serve on a jury because he knows nothing about American history or civics, he hasn't gotten a sound basic education. So in my mind, the Felder Amendment was a lot of political turmoil. They thought that they had undermined substantial equivalence. I don't think it has.
Okay, and I think this also answers the next question. If the substantial equivalency can be satisfied by teaching like religious studies, because it teaches, if it's taught in English, because it teaches reading and writing skills. But you're saying this isn't enough. It doesn't teach you some of the other things that are required.
Absolutely. And for me, I really have been working a lot these days on the importance of civic education. I think many people will agree where our country is at this state. We need kids to understand how the government works, constitutional values, the rule of law, all these important democratic values. That's why the substantial equivalence law was really passed 100 years ago. It's more important than ever. And it's not enough to have critical thinking, to basic read and write, and you got to have more than that.
Okay. I'm gonna end this, and I know there's another question. I'll leave it for the end because I don't know if this is something, but because I want to get to the other speakers. So thank you so much for being here, Professor Rebell. It was really interesting, and yeah, thank you.
My pleasure.
Our next speaker is Sarah Richmond. Sarah has extensive background in school law and educational issues. She consults for both public and private schools. She's a president of the city's schools district board of education. She's been involved in these issues. So Sarah, thank you so much for being here. And one of the reasons we wanted to have you is we know that you work with different schools and other private schools, and we wanted to hear, like, what has been your experience with people in other schools? How do other schools deal with the substantial equivalence?
Sure. Just I want to clarify one thing. I'm a past president of a school board, so
Okay.
no, but just so you know that.
Apologies.
Yeah, a lot of what I was going to talk about has been touched on both by Beatrice and Michael. That these were, when these regulations were first put into effect, they were objected to by a lot of the independent schools, the general independent schools in and around the state, because they were afraid that this was going to interfere with their autonomy as well. I mean, they're known as independent schools. When the regulations were ultimately enacted, they allowed for certain pathways that have changed that for the independent and the other parochial religious schools. As a practitioner in the area, what I see a lot happening is, there's a lot more dialogue now with lead educational agencies about what is substantial equivalence, what do we want to do, what do we want to provide, and with state ed as well. I do a lot of work with chartering new schools and starting schools or expanding charters of schools. And this has become much more in the forefront, that it's not sort of taken for granted that you're starting a school, you're going to be meeting these certain, and I think it's baseline more than anything else, which is what it is. So I think that's something as a practitioner that I'm seeing a lot more of. I also, the question about, whether teaching a certain religious text or a religious type of class could meet substantial equivalence. I know Michael was saying, generally no, if that's all of it is, but I represent some Catholic schools, and there's some, Catholic dogma and curriculum that is used and that can be used to meet some of these standards. And I think that it can be integrated. And I think that's a way that you can sort of preserve the independence of these schools, and the fact that there is a reason. There is a reason that people send their children to yeshivas. And there is a reason why people want to send their children to religious schools or independent schools and not public schools, because they do want a certain bent in whatever the education is, or a certain, overriding idea about it. But I think there has to be this baseline of education for all people, because that was one of the things also, what is society's interest? Well, society has a lot of interest in having educated students and educated citizens, from a civics perspective, from educational, from productivity. I mean, there's a lot of, the education can lead to better job opportunities, that sort of thing. We're supporting a community. So I think that's important as well. I mean, we have a lot of statutes in effect, the compulsory education, homeschooling laws that control if you're allowed to homeschool your child, but you still have to meet certain baseline requirements. You have to submit a plan to your district. You have to show that you're meeting certain guidelines, certain assessment points. So you can do that. But then we also have, CPS regulations that say that educational neglect is something that can be held against parents. And I think that's something that sort of interplays a little bit with some of this, especially in the situation where if schools are going to be shut down or found to be non-compliant, and a parent still sends their child to that school, I think you could make some sort of case for educational neglect on that point. And that is something as a societal interest. I mean, that's something that we've determined is an interest of society. So, as a practitioner, most of the clients, or most of the schools that I deal with, do comply and want to comply, but they sometimes, they find that some of the substantial equivalence requirements may have to be adjusted a little to meet with their independent curriculums and what their goals are or their missions are. And I have found that now I don't deal as much. I deal a little with the Department of Education. I deal outside of the city a lot, which is a little different, but a lot of those lead educational agencies are interested in working with the schools located in their communities to ensure, because they have an interest in all the students. And they also have to provide certain services to them. So there's that as well. I mean, they have to provide special education services. They have to provide transportation. They have to provide books if that's asked for, their nursing services. So there is a cooperative relationship with them as well. But, it all, as I said, has to be done with this framework of meeting a certain baseline for all students.
So I had a quick question. I had spoken to an official who's involved in various Catholic schools, and the sense I got from him was that there's an unease about the government getting like with the whole discussion about substantial equivalence, and he acknowledged, like what you said, like that there's a difference between when kids don't even get a basic education versus a school like a good Catholic school that has like various religious interests. But there's like still like an unease of the government getting involved, and it's like, I guess it's about drawing the line. But like, what has been your experience? Like, have you had that? Like, do people? Yeah.
So I worked with charting a very religious Catholic school, not a diocese school, an independent one, that was concerned about the health curriculum, and said that the health curriculum now, it doesn't teach sex ed, but it teaches AIDS and HIV, and it has to teach, a lot of different things that they're just not comfortable. And they were able to work out a resolution with state ed that they were providing the basic requirements of a health education as New York State required, as well as balancing their needs. And I would hope that that's something that ultimately could be worked out with the yeshivas, that there could be, because there has to be respect for different opinions and for different cultures and for, different religions. There just has to be. I mean, that's our pluralistic society. That's the way we are. But there still also has to be these baselines. And I think what I've been finding is that there are ways to respect both and to work with it. But it does come up. I mean, I think it's going to come up more and more with, you know, as New York's, especially now, I think the country's turning a little bit more conservative. And New York State especially is less conservative. And I think some of that progressive agenda is going to come into conflict with some of these schools as well.
Yeah, and I think the other difference, and it was like what Beatrice said before, like some of these parents in the yeshivas don't really have a choice. You know, they have to send to specific schools, whereas like in some of the Catholic schools, my understanding is that people do have a choice. Like if they don't like the school, they can send their kids to other schools.
Well, I think
So-
the community is not as entrenched in all
Right.
day-to-day life decisions as they are for the Hasidic community. I mean, I think that's just that's a cultural thing. So yes, of course, you know, you're not going to get excommunicated if you don't send your child to Catholic school, right? It's a little different. But you know, you could get excommunicated. I mean, I'm not that versed on Catholicism, you know, but you know, you certainly can run afoul of your community if you don't support the values of that community, whether it be a Catholic community, a Jewish community, not a secular community.
Okay. Well, we're running short on time, so
I'll pass
thank you
it to
so
Burt.
much for being here, Sarah. I appreciate it. And we're going to move on to Professor Neuborne because I wanted to touch on some of the constitutional issues. And like Sarah has mentioned, the country as a whole is moving more conservative, and I think it's something we're going to have to contend with as it relates to many issues, but even to this issue. So I wanted to welcome Professor Neuborne. Professor Neuborne is the new endorsement professor of civil liberties and the founding director of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School. He's been one of the nation's foremost civil liberty lawyers and served as the national legal director of the ACLU and many other important organizations. He argued numerous Supreme Court cases, litigated hundreds of the most important constitutional cases. So it's really a pleasure to welcome you here, Professor.
Thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here. I've learned an enormous amount from the first three speakers. Thank you.
Yeah.
My sense is that I'm not quite sure why I'm here, because you really ought to have John Dewey here. I mean, this is really a discussion about the role of education in democracy and how education and forging a vibrant democracy go hand in hand. Law, of course, is going to touch it, and law, of course, is going to be drawn in by contesting parties. But my hope is ultimately this is resolved as an educational issue and not as a technical legal issue. Now, having said that, the question raises the idea to the degree to which the state can essentially intrude into the religion, a school operated by an intensely closed religious community, and demand that that school teach certain things when the religious community doesn't want to teach those things, is an extremely difficult issue. It's not a simple question of this is not a good idea. I think it's a terrible idea to not give young people the kind of education they need. But the issue is not whether it's a terrible idea. The issue is whether or not in a pluralistic society, there's sufficient autonomy given to groups that are outside the mainstream to essentially live by tenets that we think are terrible ideas. And that we have to then leave them alone. And this is not the first time this has come up. As Professor Rebell indicated, when we made a decision, when John Dewey persuaded everybody about the importance of education to democracy, and the various states began to pass compulsory education laws, it wasn't long before those compulsory education laws collided with religious organizations that were teaching things that were different than what people like me thought would be good ideas to be taught in the public schools. And the first targets were Catholic schools. The first targets were schools that Catholic schools were viewed with immense distrust at the beginning of the century. They were viewed as places that were inimical to democracy, that taught subservience to the Pope, that taught the sense that people were not true patriots to the United States, that they had other loyalties that were greater than the United States, and they were viewed with enormous suspicion. And Oregon just decided to shut them down. Oregon passed a statute that said our compulsory education law requires everyone to send their kids to secular school. And religious schools can operate after the secular schools are over, but they can't be the primary form of satisfying compulsory education. And that went up to the Supreme Court. And interestingly enough, it went up to the Supreme Court before there was an enforceable First Amendment. The First Amendment was not enforceable against the states until the late 1920s. And it wasn't until the 1930s that the states were held subject to the First Amendment. This was as a matter of substantive due process of law, the kind of inherent values that all of us have, and we don't need a text to tell us what it is. We all know what the right thing is. And the Supreme Court held overwhelmingly that parents have an absolute right under due process to educate their children as they wish. And if that means sending them to a parochial school or to a private school, instead of to a state-run public school, they can do that. And there's absolutely nothing the state can do to stop them. Now, as Professor Rebell indicated, I think there's a quid pro quo here. I think that the quid pro quo is, yes, the parents have that right, but they can't send the child to a school that won't educate the child at all. They can send this. They can send it to the school that educates the child in ways that we think is not a good idea. They can send this to a school that educates ways that are way out of the mainstream. But when the kid gets out of the school, he has to be able to function as a citizen in a democracy. That, of course, is a debatable question, what you need. The argument that all you need to be a good citizen in a democracy is the ability to think critically, which is what the Hasidic schools are arguing now. We teach critical thinking. Who cares about who George Washington was? Who cares about who Martin Van Buren was? The important thing is to be able to think critically. And when somebody makes an argument to you about whether you should vote one way or another, you can dissect that argument because you know how to think critically. And I have to tell you, as a law professor who've taught, this is now my 52nd year at NYU, the students who think critically in my classes and are able to dissect the analysis in my classes are the kids that have come out of who've had strong Talmudic education. The strong Talmudic education makes them wonderful, logical splitters and argue about technique and things like that. So I have a great deal of respect for the degree that these schools can arm students to be critical thinking. What we need is some sort of consensus to go beyond that, to say, sure, critical thinking is great, but you have to have some context against which to apply the critical thinking. And if you have absolutely no idea of how the political system works, or no idea of what ideas have been tried in the past have failed, and what ideas in the past have succeeded, if you haven't studied history and you haven't studied civics, then the best critical thinker in the world is not going to be an informed voter. We have to come to grips with that. So the next step in the constitutional train, the first case was Pierce versus the Society of Sisters. Back in the 1920s, it said you can send your kids to a religious school and nobody can say anything about it. The next step is in 1972, when the Amish, the old order Amish, a closed, very, very intensely closed community in Wisconsin, sought an exemption from the compulsory education law. They said, look, we'll send our kids for compulsory education through the 8th grade, but we don't want to send them beyond that. We think that our community is sufficiently self-contained, that we'll take care of our own, that we don't need help from the outside, and we don't ask for help from the outside, and we would like the outside to keep its hands off of us. And so what we will do is we seek an exemption from the Wisconsin compulsory education law. And the Supreme Court granted the exemption, holding that the old order Amish were an extremely effective society who did take care of their own and were functioning members of the Wisconsin polity, and that the additional education that the kids would get over the 8th grade wasn't really necessary. And that therefore, since there was such a strong religious aversion to it, we would essentially defer to the religious values of the Amish community. And there was a magnificent dissent written in that case by Justice Douglas. He wrote only for himself. It was an 8-1 decision, but he wrote a dissent that said, what about the kids? Their only chance to make an autonomous decision about who they're going to be is if they're exposed to the outside world. If they're not exposed to ideas in the outside world, how can they ever make a free decision about whether to stay within the community or move beyond the community? And how can the community ever ask itself about whether it should change? So Douglas wrote this really impassioned dissent that said, you cannot close the window that these kids have to look to an outside world just because it's what their parents and their religious community want. Unfortunately, he wrote only for himself. And so the law is 8-1 against him. And today, when brilliant people like Michael Rebell try to reignite that idea that the children have an independent right here, and it's not just a right to learn to read, it's a right to escape if that's what they want. It's a right to allow them the autonomous choice that we want to make sure that their parents have to retain the community that they wish. But it's not an autonomous choice. I mean, there's a great irony here, because what the Hasidic schools are doing is they're using control over their educational system to impose a system of values on the children that will then make it impossible for the children to ever question whether those are the kinds of values that you want to have. I was censored for a moment, but I managed to get back. So this is an extraordinarily difficult question, because you have to balance the autonomous rights of the community against the needs of the state, and you don't want to lose the special concerns that you have for the children in this situation. Now, let me say, up until now, whenever there's been a collision like this between strong needs of the state and strong arguments of autonomy for the religious communities, we've worked it out so that the state can impose minimum requirements. So the state can impose vaccination requirements. The state can impose compulsory education requirements. The state can require the children of Jehovah's Witnesses to receive blood transfusions to prevent them from dying. The state can intervene in all sorts of ways to protect weak and vulnerable people who would otherwise find themselves in dreadful shape because of restrictions imposed by religious autonomy. So up until now, the balance has been that when the religion collides with the state, if the state's argument is strong enough, the state will be able to impose minimal restrictions on the religious communities. As all of you have pointed out now, we may be living in a different America. It's not at all clear to me that old balance, the balance that said that you can make religious kids take vaccinations, that you can make them go to, you can impose health requirements on them, minimum wage, maximum hours. All of the religious exemptions were sought for all of those things, and by and large, they were rejected. I don't know. I mean, the one thing I'm sure about is this very interesting case that you were talking about in the New York Court of Appeals. The issue is not going to end in the New York Court of Appeals. The issue is going to end in the Supreme Court of the United States, because ultimately the question is going to be, does the free exercise of religion guarantee these schools a kind of autonomy? And so, yes, arguing about the specific authorization of the educational authorities for remedies, very important. Arguing about the precise standards that the New York rules impose, very important. But eventually, it's going to move up to the Supreme Court. Maybe not this case, but a case will move up to the Supreme Court, and the court is going to make a balance between the religious interests and the secular interests. And I am genuinely afraid of what that balance will be.
Well, thank you. This is really fascinating stuff. I just wanted to get to some of the questions that were raised. First from Gavin Mackey. This is how did the recent SCOTUS cases, especially Kennedy and Carson, I'm not familiar with these cases, but how did they affect the holding in Pierce? And what might they portend for the future?
I don't think they changed the Pierce case. The questions about whether and how one has to provide aid to parochial schools if you give the same kind of aid to a public school. And those are I think that's the case that the questioner is asking about. The Supreme Court has started down a road up most of my career. We argued about whether it was possible for the government to voluntarily give aid to parochial schools.
Oh.
Now the question has changed to say, if they give aid to secular schools, do they have to give the same type of aid to parochial schools as a matter of equality? I'm not sure that changes the idea of Pierce. It may be now people will send their kids to religious schools and then demand that the state subsidize them. That is on the horizon, but that's, I think, several cases away before that will happen.
So, and going back to what we discussed before with Professor Rebell, if a school is deemed to be not substantially equivalent, and the school and the state wants to shut it down, but the school, let's say, continues, or the school doesn't.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, Michael, because I had a note that I wanted to just say. Again, please, I'm not an expert on educational policy, and I don't want to pretend that I am. But to me, just generally, as a constitutional lawyer over the years, I've always thought that there's a divide between remedies. And one remedy is coercive. The state issues a mandate and punishes you in some way if you don't live up to the mandate. They put the parent in jail, they close the school down, they do something, but they bring the power of the state to bear in order to enforce the mandate. The second vision is no, the state says you're out of compliance and we'll give you the resources to go back into compliance. So, for example, a case that I argued years ago dealt with a decision by the government to put remedial reading teachers into parochial schools. And the argument was that that was a violation of the Establishment Clause because it allowed the government to aid religious schools. And my response was, yes, but you've got these kids in the schools who can't read. And if they can't read, how are they going to function in the society? So if the state wants to say, I'm not going to punish the school for not teaching the kid to read, what I'm going to do is put a teacher in there who'll teach the kid to read. And that worked.
But if the school resists, it sounded like some of the school resists. Like
they don't resist. And you know what they did? They built Quonset huts outside the schools, where the teachers would, as the kids left school, the teachers would say, it's want to learn to read, and the kids would come into the Quonset huts and they learned to read, and it was a brilliantly successful program. They managed to get the young kids who were unable in the regular curriculum, and these are in parochial schools. In the regular curriculum, they were unable to learn to read. These special remedial reading teachers were brilliantly successful in working with them in small groups and increasing. There's no reason why we can't think of the Hasidic schools the same way. If the Hasidic schools lack the capacity to deliver this type of education to the child, one possibility is to punish them, shut them down, make the parents go away. The other possibility is to infuse the resources into the schools. And let them teach the kids the things we desperately think they need, and we have to win the confidence of the Hasidic schools that we're not trying to undermine them or, in some sense, harm their authority. But I think that could be done. There are people of goodwill who would like to teach a very smart 9-year-old kid who is in the process of learning how to critically think because he's dissecting the Talmud. Do you know how fast you can teach a kid like that to read? And so my sense is that this is it's a doable thing.
Yeah.
If we
Actually, Bert, I think the regulations would permit that. You know, as Sarah was saying, with some of the Catholic schools, when they ran into issues that arguably made them non-compliant with the law, the state ed department worked with them and found ways around it. The regulations do require the local education authorities, let's say the New York City Department of Education, to try to work something out with the school that's been found non-compliant. And they actually have a time frame that there can't be penalties or this declaration that the school's out of compliance until that process has been gone into. Now, whether the New York City Board of Ed would offer to send trained English language teachers into the school, I don't know. I would think under well, it may run into some of the problems that your original case did, but I think the reaction so far, as Beatrice was pointing out, is that these schools are not interested in cooperating and compromising, in coming up with some way.
And Michael, why do you think that is? Do you think that they're nervous about losing absolute authority, or do you think that they're suspicious of outsiders? Or because I was thinking that Beatrice could be a key to this. That it's entirely possible to organize a core of Hasids who would be within the community and who would be trustworthy to these people and make them the core of the people that went in there to teach the English and teach the subjects. And you wouldn't have a sense of being invaded by outsiders. You have a sense of being helped by your own.
My understanding, Beatrice, you ought to speak to that. My understanding is that some members of YAFFED or people affiliated with YAFFED have been trying to do that, to reach out to the members of the community and see if a dialogue can begin to deal with all of this.
You know, over the years, what's happened is this desire for autonomy over education has become like a rallying cry. And you have people, you know, getting up there and saying, you know, put us in jail, like we will go to jail over this. There is no way we will allow anybody. So it's reached a point where I think, yes, in theory, absolutely, that's how it should be. But I think until the schools will really feel that they have something to lose, they're kind of betting on the fact that they have so much political power. Just over the last legislative session, there were 3 separate attempts to introduce legislation that almost went through that would delay the implementation of substantial equivalency by 5 years and greatly water it down. So I think they're still banking on they'll be able to use kind of their political and legal work to push this off. I think in order for that dialogue to happen, they have to realize that this is serious. It's actually going to happen and there will be repercussions. I think at that point, they'll be ready to have those conversations. You know, that's the hope.
Yeah, and just to add to that, like Arthur made a comment that this is a community that voted very, very strongly for Trump, and they're betting on Trump getting involved. I don't know about that, but I mean, I guess it makes sense. You know, it's so, yeah, it's.
Well, that's only if they believe that there's some value in keeping their children ignorant. And I'm just, you know, I'm trying to put myself in the position of the leader of one of these Hasidic schools. I don't want to lose control of the school. First of all, it's important for the continuation of my religious values. Plus, I'm, you know, making a little money out of it. I mean, all that money is pouring in. I don't want to lose it. I don't want to lose control of the money. I don't trust some of the outsiders who come in and tell me they're going to help me. You know, too many Jews in too many settings have been helped by outsiders to a place where they don't want to go. So I don't trust that. So how can we reach the leadership of those schools and persuade them that what's going to be done is going to be done in ways that won't threaten the core interests that they're afraid of, and that they're afraid of losing?
You know,
And
as you yourself said, if these kids become educated, some of them are going to use critical thinking to assert their own autonomy. And
Although it's interesting, what Beatrice said is that in the Haredi community, where the schools are excellent in many ways, they don't have a higher proportion of people leaving. They don't leave. Now, they may challenge the existing internal structure, but they don't walk away from their
But if
culture.
you're asking what the leaders may be afraid of, and look at the power they have now from having these solid voting blocks. If people start really getting an education, not 90% of them would vote for Trump, perhaps, and whatever influence these leaders get by dealing with de Blasio, with Kathy Hochul, whoever it is that they're influencing, their authority is weakened. There's no doubt about that.
I want to emphasize that this issue politically is across the aisle. As recently as a couple of weeks ago, and it's publicly out there, so you could check it there. We had Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer promise one of the Rebbe's they are going to take care of this issue and make this issue go away. We had a legislator go up to the, get voted in for the assembly with a promise that he's going to make sure that this goes away. So there's still a lot of that going around, and that needs to stop. Like the community needs to realize this is the law. Like all that political talk is not real, and this is the law, and it's going to happen. I think at that point, the opportunity for conversation. I know that I didn't have time to talk about kind of the hope. So here's the hope side of things. Number one, there are organizations within the community that are working to develop curriculums that are socially appropriate, and they're opening it up. And there's slowly a trickle. So that's very hopeful. In Israel, right, as I mentioned, this is an international problem. In Israel, some of the larger Hasidic groups have started implementing a general curriculum in the boys' yeshivas, which is like astounding, very recent. And again, efforts to make this change started earlier in Israel. So there is hope, and the parents' dissatisfaction. But at this point, they're still viewing, for the most part, any intervention into the education as something harmful to be opposed resolutely. So in theory, I think this is good, but they're not there yet, unfortunately.
I want to be cognizant of the time, and just, I guess if anyone wants to stay a bit longer, we can, I don't know if there's an option, but I just wanted to thank everyone for being here tonight, all the speakers. And I also wanted to thank the City Bar Association leadership, the Civil Rights Committee, the Educational Law Committee, and a special thanks to the subcommittee who arranged this, Rebecca Berkebile, Jonathan Glader, Erin McGinnis, Judy Schechter, Ned Kassman, Stephanie Coyle, and a special thanks to Patricia Jandrozik for all her work on this. So thank you everyone for coming. Thank you for this really interesting and fascinating conversation. There are some questions, I guess, if people want to stay a bit longer to answer these questions, feel free to do so, but thanks for doing that. So Beatrice, can you stay another few minutes? I think these questions. So somebody's asking, like, don't the Orthodox Jews save public money by not sending their children to public school? Now, I don't know, like, what would you say to that?
Well, they still pay taxes. I mean, if you send your child to parochial school, you're not exempt from the taxes that support the public school. So you don't save money by sending your kid to a parochial school. You're still paying the taxes.
I think he's meaning to say that public schools get more money than private schools.
I don't know the data on that. That's possible. Again, there's still a lot of money going to the non-public schools through the way of school lunches, nutrition, school buses, textbooks, title programs. And in New York City, there's a lot of voucher dollars going towards these schools. The after school programs for children is being directed to these yeshivas, which is approximately $10,000 a child. So there's a lot. Yes, it's probably less money, but still a lot of money. It's possible that there's less money. But ultimately, if you look at the rate of social service programs that the community relies on, that's well above average. When you look at the Hasidic communities in New York City and across the state, they have some of the poorest villages are Hasidic communities that rely on the government services and different social services. And, you know, a value in New York State is not to how can we save money so that we end up, you know, having children that need to rely on social service programs to survive. I don't think that's anybody's goal in this state.
Yeah, the way I read that question, I think the questioner was saying, doesn't the public save money by the fact that these kids
Yeah.
private yeshiva and they don't go to a public school? I don't know if the implication was that because the public is benefiting in this monetary sense of having fewer kids in the public schools, that we should leave them alone and let them do whatever they want. But whatever your philosophy may be on that, the existing law, both constitutional in New York State and statutory, says these kids have to go to a school to teach them the substantial equivalent subjects.
Okay, well, thank you so much for everyone for being here. And yeah, this is a conversation that will continue, I'm sure.
Yeah.
This issue isn't going away.
Thank you, Michael. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you all.
Michael. Thank you. Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Yeah,
Good night.
Michael, Burt.